The crisis facing American democracy today mirrors precisely the challenges I witnessed in Parliament when colonial representatives spoke of taxation without representation. Yet the deeper question remains: what constitutes true representation in a republic? Many assume that following the momentary will of constituents defines democratic duty, but experience teaches us that authentic representation requires something far more sophisticated. The founders of your republic, having absorbed the lessons of my parliamentary speeches on America, understood that representatives must serve not as mere delegates, but as trustees of the general good. This distinction between delegation and trusteeship has shaped American democracy in ways that few appreciate, yet understanding it remains crucial for preserving constitutional government. Today, as populist movements challenge traditional notions of representative authority, we must return to first principles. What did the founders truly mean by representation? How does prudent judgment balance popular will with constitutional wisdom? The answer lies in understanding representation as both an art and a sacred trust. Chapter 1: The Nature of True Representation versus Mere Delegation. When I addressed the electors of Bristol in 1774, I articulated a principle that would echo through the halls of Philadelphia and profoundly influence American constitutional thinking: representatives owe their constituents not blind obedience, but their mature judgment. This distinction between delegation and trusteeship became foundational to American democracy, though its implications remain poorly understood even today. The delegates who crafted your Constitution had witnessed the chaos of pure democracy in state legislatures where representatives functioned as mere conduits for popular passion. They understood, from my parliamentary experience, that government requires deliberation, not just aggregation of immediate desires. True representation elevates and refines popular will through the filter of informed judgment and constitutional principle. Consider how this wisdom shaped the Senate's design. Unlike the House, senators were originally chosen by state legislatures, creating distance between popular passion and legislative judgment. This reflected my conviction that representatives must sometimes act against apparent constituent wishes to serve the deeper, long-term interests of the people. The founders recognized that democracy without such filtering mechanisms becomes mob rule. James Madison's theory of extending the sphere drew directly from my observations about representation in large territories. During the American crisis, I argued that virtual representation could connect distant peoples to Parliament through shared interests and sympathetic understanding. Madison adapted this insight, arguing that in a large republic, representatives would necessarily serve broader constituencies, making them less susceptible to narrow factional pressures. The Electoral College similarly embodies Burkean principles of representation. Rather than direct democracy, it creates a body of electors expected to exercise independent judgment about presidential fitness. The founders understood that representation involves not just conveying popular will, but refining it through constitutional wisdom and deliberative judgment. This principle explains why American democracy initially limited direct election to the House alone. The Constitution created multiple layers of representation: state legislatures choosing senators, electors choosing presidents, lifetime tenured judges, each designed to filter and refine democratic will through different forms of representative wisdom. My speeches defending American colonists while insisting on parliamentary supremacy taught the founders that representation must balance local knowledge with imperial perspective, particular interests with general good. They created a federal system where representatives serve simultaneously as advocates for their constituents and guardians of national unity. The genius of American representation lies in its Burkean understanding that democracy requires both responsiveness and responsibility, both popular accountability and independent judgment. Representatives must know their districts intimately while viewing issues from the elevated perspective of constitutional principle and national interest. Chapter 2: Constitutional Wisdom over Popular Passion. My observations of the French Revolution provided American founders with a cautionary tale about democracy without constitutional constraints. When representatives become mere agents of popular will, divorced from constitutional wisdom and historical precedent, republics collapse into anarchy or despotism. The founders designed American democracy to embody what I called ordered liberty, popular government channeled through constitutional forms. The contrast between the American Revolution and the French catastrophe illustrates perfectly the difference between prudent reform and destructive innovation. Your founders sought independence through appeals to ancient English liberties and constitutional precedent. They framed their cause in terms of traditional rights violated, not abstract principles newly discovered. This Burkean approach produced stable institutions rather than revolutionary chaos. The French Assembly, by contrast, attempted to remake society according to theoretical blueprints, dismissing centuries of accumulated wisdom as mere prejudice. They reduced representatives to delegates carrying out the general will, eliminating the independent judgment that constitutional government requires. The result was precisely what I predicted: the collapse of all intermediate institutions and the rise of democratic despotism. American federalism embodies my principle that political communities are complex organic growths that cannot be reconstructed according to abstract logic. The founders preserved existing state constitutions and local institutions, gradually adapting them to republican purposes rather than sweeping them away. This respect for historical development distinguishes American democracy from revolutionary experiments that treat tradition as an obstacle to be eliminated. The Bill of Rights reflects Burkean skepticism about governmental power, even democratic power. While trusting representatives with broad authority, the founders recognized that popular government could threaten individual liberty as readily as monarchical tyranny. Constitutional limitations protect what I called the little platoons of civil society, churches, families, voluntary associations, that nurture civic virtue and check governmental ambition. Judicial review, though not explicitly constitutional, emerged from Burkean principles of constitutional interpretation. Federal judges, insulated from electoral pressure through life tenure and secure salary, could check both legislative and executive overreach. They serve as guardians of constitutional tradition against the passionate impulses that periodically sweep democratic societies. The founders' treatment of religion illustrates their Burkean understanding that constitutional government requires moral foundations that politics alone cannot provide. While prohibiting religious establishments, they assumed that voluntary religious communities would cultivate the civic virtues necessary for self-government. They separated church and state while recognizing their mutual dependence in forming republican character. This balance between popular sovereignty and constitutional limitation reflects my conviction that free government requires both democratic accountability and institutional wisdom. Representatives must answer to the people while serving higher constitutional purposes that transcend immediate popular desires. The genius of American constitutionalism lies in creating what I advocated, a system where democratic energy operates within traditional forms, where popular will expresses itself through institutions that refine and elevate rather than merely aggregate citizen preferences. Chapter 3: The Art of Political Judgment in Representative Government. During my decades in Parliament, I learned that successful representation requires what we might call practical wisdom, the ability to discern not just what constituents want, but what they truly need for their long-term flourishing. This distinction between immediate desires and genuine interests became central to how American founders conceived representative duty, and it remains crucial for understanding how democracy should function. The American constitutional system creates multiple forums for exercising such judgment. Congressional deliberation, properly understood, serves not merely to register predetermined positions but to test ideas against constitutional principle and practical experience. When representatives truly deliberate, they model for citizens the kind of reasoning that republican government requires. Consider how this principle shaped the founders' approach to foreign policy. They granted the president broad executive power in international affairs, recognizing that foreign relations require the kind of prudential judgment that popular assemblies cannot easily provide. Yet they required Senate consent for treaties, ensuring that executive judgment would be tested against the deliberative wisdom of a body designed to represent long-term national interests. The impeachment power illustrates how constitutional design can elevate political judgment above partisan passion. By requiring not just House accusation but Senate conviction, and by setting the standard at high crimes and misdemeanors, rather than mere policy disagreement, the founders created a process that demands the kind of grave constitutional judgment I advocated in my speeches on public morality and political responsibility. The amendment process similarly embodies Burkean principles of gradual reform guided by deliberative judgment. Constitutional change requires not just momentary popular majorities but sustained consensus across multiple elections and deliberative bodies. This ensures that fundamental law evolves through the kind of careful consideration that distinguishes prudent reform from reckless innovation. My defense of party government in Parliament influenced how Americans came to understand political organizations. Parties, properly conceived, serve as schools of political judgment, bringing together like-minded citizens to develop coherent approaches to public policy. They elevate political discourse above mere interest group bargaining by requiring participants to articulate principled positions on fundamental questions. Yet parties also pose dangers that require the kind of institutional checks I advocated. When party loyalty overrides constitutional duty, representatives become faction leaders rather than public trustees. The founders' separation of powers creates incentives for representatives to check even their partisan allies when constitutional principles are at stake. The tension between local knowledge and national perspective requires representatives to exercise what I called enlarged views, without losing touch with constituent concerns. A representative from rural Georgia must understand agricultural interests while grasping how trade policy affects the entire Union. This dual responsibility demands the kind of political wisdom that pure delegation cannot provide. Such judgment develops through what I termed habits of business, sustained engagement with public affairs that gradually cultivates practical wisdom. Representatives learn by governing, developing intuition about which policies will succeed and which will fail based on accumulated experience rather than theoretical speculation. Take a moment to consider, how many of today's political leaders demonstrate this kind of seasoned judgment versus mere ideological consistency or popular appeal? Chapter 4: Federalism as the Science of Balancing Interests. The American federal system represents perhaps the most sophisticated application of my principles regarding imperial governance and the science of politics. Having witnessed Parliament's failure to govern a diverse empire through uniform policies, I advocated what Americans would later perfect, a system that preserves unity while respecting local diversity and particular interests. My speeches during the American crisis emphasized that effective governance of large territories requires what I called wise and salutary neglect, allowing local communities to manage their particular concerns while maintaining allegiance to common constitutional principles. The founders transformed this insight into a constitutional science, creating overlapping jurisdictions that balance national unity with local self-government. Federal representation embodies my conviction that different interests require different forms of political expression. The House represents citizens directly in proportion to population, ensuring that democratic energy finds constitutional outlet. The Senate represents states as corporate entities, preserving federalism by giving smaller communities voice in national councils. This dual representation prevents both pure democracy and pure confederacy, creating what Madison called a compound republic. The division of powers between federal and state governments reflects my understanding that political communities have natural limits beyond which government becomes oppressive or ineffective. States retain authority over the daily concerns of civil society, education, marriage, property law, criminal justice, that require local knowledge and community standards. The federal government handles truly national concerns, defense, interstate commerce, foreign relations, that transcend state boundaries. This arrangement protects what I cherished most, the little platoons of civil society that form citizen character and mediate between individuals and distant governments. Local governments, being closer to the people, can respond more readily to particular circumstances while experimenting with different approaches to common problems. Federal oversight prevents such experimentation from violating fundamental rights or national interests. Consider how this system handles economic policy. States can adapt regulations to local conditions. What works in industrial Massachusetts may not suit agricultural Alabama, while federal authority prevents trade wars and ensures national economic unity. Representatives must understand both their local economies and national market dynamics, requiring the kind of comprehensive judgment that mere delegation cannot provide. The beauty of American federalism lies in its recognition that different political goods require different institutional arrangements. Local representation can be more direct and responsive because local communities share more homogeneous interests. National representation must be more deliberative and reflective because it must reconcile diverse regional interests within constitutional bounds. My theory of virtual representation finds its fulfillment in how federal representatives serve not just their immediate constituents but the broader interests of their regions and the nation. A senator from California must certainly attend to California's particular needs, but also consider how California policies affect sister states and national well-being. This system creates what I advocated, multiple levels of political attachment that prevent both excessive localism and dangerous centralization. Citizens identify simultaneously as residents of particular communities, citizens of sovereign states, and members of a national republic. Such layered loyalties provide stability by ensuring that no single political identity can monopolize citizen affections. The federal structure also embodies my principle that political unity must grow organically from shared experience rather than being imposed through abstract theory. The American Union developed gradually through common struggles, shared institutions, and mutual accommodation, creating the kind of deep political bonds that revolutionary assemblies cannot manufacture through mere declaration. Chapter 5: Religion, Morality, and the Foundations of Republican Character. In my reflections on the French Revolution, I emphasize that free government requires moral foundations that politics alone cannot provide. The American founders understood this insight profoundly, creating a system that separates church and state while recognizing their essential partnership in forming the republican character necessary for self-government. The First Amendment embodies what I advocated, religious liberty within a framework that acknowledges religion's public importance. By prohibiting religious establishments while protecting free exercise, the founders prevented the kind of destructive conflicts between political and ecclesiastical authority that plagued Europe. Yet they assumed that voluntary religious communities would cultivate the civic virtues, honesty, industry, compassion, self-restraint, that republican government requires. This delicate balance reflects my conviction that religion provides the moral habits that make political freedom possible. When citizens govern themselves through internal moral discipline, external coercion becomes unnecessary. When religious formation breaks down, governments must expand their regulatory reach to manage the social consequences of moral decay. American representation depends crucially on this religious foundation. Representatives must exercise independent judgment about the public good, but such judgment requires moral character that purely secular education cannot reliably produce. The founders expected that citizens formed by religious communities would choose representatives capable of rising above narrow self-interest to serve authentic common good. Consider how religious diversity enriches American representation. Different denominational traditions contribute distinct moral insights to public discourse, Puritan emphasis on civic duty, Catholic social teaching, Jewish concern for justice, Protestant individualism. Representatives drawing from these varied traditions bring different perspectives to bear on common challenges, creating the kind of moral dialogue that strengthens rather than weakens political community. The voluntary character of American religion enhances rather than diminishes its political value. When citizens choose their religious commitments freely, those commitments shape character more deeply than state-imposed orthodoxies. Free churches produce citizens capable of free government because both require the internal moral discipline that coercion cannot create. My speeches on the impeachment of Warren Hastings demonstrated how political authority without moral constraint becomes tyrannical oppression. American constitutional design creates multiple safeguards against such corruption: elections, impeachment, judicial review, federalism, but all depend ultimately on citizens and representatives formed by moral communities that transcend political calculation. The founders' approach to education reflects this understanding. While avoiding religious establishments, they expected local communities to ensure that rising generations received the moral formation necessary for Republican citizenship. Public schools would teach civic knowledge, but families and churches would form civic character. This division of moral labor prevents both theocracy and secular despotism. Religious communities shape private conscience and voluntary association, while political institutions protect the framework within which such formation can occur. Neither can fulfill its proper function without the other's complementary contribution. The genius of American religious liberty lies in creating space for what I called moral imagination, the capacity to envision human flourishing beyond immediate material interests. Religious communities cultivate such imagination through worship, charity, and mutual care that model the kind of concern for common good that Republican representation requires. When representatives lack such moral formation, they become mere brokers of competing interests rather than trustees of public welfare. They can negotiate temporary compromises between contending factions, but they cannot articulate the kind of inspiring vision that calls citizens to transcend narrow self-concern for genuine patriotic service. The decline of religious formation thus poses profound challenges for American democracy. As voluntary associations weaken, citizens lose the intermediate loyalties that mediate between individual desire and national identification. Representatives drawn from such morally fragmented communities struggle to exercise the kind of independent judgment that constitutional government requires. Reflect for a moment. Can a society that abandons moral formation maintain the civic virtues necessary for self-government? Chapter 6: Empire, Federation, and the Lessons of Imperial Governance. My experience defending American colonists while maintaining imperial unity taught me that successful governance of diverse territories requires what Americans would perfect as federal science: preserving overall political community while respecting local autonomy and particular circumstances. The American federal system represents the most sophisticated solution ever devised to the ancient problem of uniting diverse peoples under common government. During the American crisis, I argued that Parliament's attempt to govern colonial internal affairs through uniform policies ignored the fundamental principle that different communities require different forms of regulation. The Tea Act and Stamp Act failed not because they were unjust in principle, but because they violated the practical wisdom that distant governments cannot manage local concerns effectively. The founders absorbed this lesson, creating a system where local matters remain under local control while truly national concerns receive national treatment. This division prevents both the oppressive centralization that destroyed imperial unity and the dangerous fragmentation that made the Articles of Confederation inadequate for national defense and economic coordination. American territorial expansion has repeatedly tested these principles. The Northwest Ordinance established the crucial precedent that new territories would eventually join the Union as equal states rather than remaining permanent dependencies. This commitment to eventual equality prevented the imperial overstretch that destroyed other federal experiments by creating permanent class divisions between ruling and ruled territories. The constitutional provision that new states enter on equal terms with original states embodies my principle that political communities must grow organically through consent rather than conquest. Each new state enriches the federal union by contributing distinct regional perspectives and interests, but within a common constitutional framework that ensures national unity. Consider how this federal expansion created new forms of representation. As the frontier moved westward, representatives from newer states brought different perspectives on land policy, internal improvements, and economic development. This diversity enriched national deliberation by ensuring that policies would be tested against varied regional experience rather than imposed from a single metropolitan center. The federal structure also prevents the kind of imperial decay I witnessed in British governance of distant territories. American territories remain connected to the constitutional center through representation rather than mere administration. Territorial delegates in Congress ensure that frontier interests receive hearing before becoming states with full representation. My theory of virtual representation finds its fullest development in how federal representatives serve not just their immediate constituents but broader regional and national interests. A representative from Ohio must certainly serve Ohio's particular concerns, but also consider how Ohio policies affect neighboring states and national development. Such layered representation prevents both excessive localism and imperial centralization. The Civil War tested whether federal principles could survive fundamental disagreement about human freedom. The conflict vindicated my conviction that political communities cannot endure permanent contradictions between local practice and national principle. The war preserved the Union by ensuring that federal citizenship would mean the same thing in every state. Reconstruction demonstrated both the possibilities and limits of federal intervention in local affairs. The federal government could establish basic rights and constitutional principles, but it could not directly transform local social relationships without the kind of sustained coercion that would have destroyed federal character itself. American foreign policy reflects federal principles in its approach to international relations. Rather than seeking to impose uniform government on diverse nations, Americans have generally promoted what we might call international federalism, common frameworks for trade, security, and diplomacy that preserve national sovereignty while enabling peaceful cooperation. The challenge facing contemporary America is maintaining federal balance in an era of increased economic integration and global communication. When national markets and instant communication reduce regional differences, what becomes the proper scope of federal versus state authority? How can representation remain meaningful when local communities lose their distinctive character? My experience suggests that federal systems thrive when they respect the natural differences between communities while providing frameworks for peaceful interaction. American federalism succeeds when it enables local experimentation within constitutional bounds rather than mandating uniform policies across diverse territories. Chapter 7: Burkean Principles in Contemporary American Governance. The principles of representation I developed through parliamentary experience remain remarkably relevant to contemporary American challenges. Today's polarization, decline of deliberative norms, and crisis of institutional trust reflect precisely the dangers I warned against when representatives abandon independent judgment for factional loyalty or popular pandering. Contemporary American democracy suffers from what I would recognize as the collapse of what might be called representative distance, the space between immediate popular desires and considered political judgment that constitutional government requires. Social media and polling data create pressure for instant responsiveness that prevents the kind of deliberative reflection that wise policy demands. The founders designed American institutions to create such deliberative space through staggered elections, lengthy terms, and complex procedures that slow democratic impulses enough to permit careful consideration. Yet these constitutional safeguards lose effectiveness when representatives voluntarily surrender independent judgment to avoid electoral risk or partisan criticism. Consider how contemporary primary elections often punish representatives who demonstrate the kind of independent thinking I advocated. When party activists demand ideological purity over practical wisdom, they destroy the very capacity for political judgment that effective representation requires. Representatives become afraid to acknowledge complexity or uncertainty, pretending to certainty they cannot possess about issues requiring prudential assessment. The revival of American democracy requires what I would call conservative reform, changes that restore rather than reject constitutional principles. This means strengthening rather than weakening representative institutions, but using them for their proper constitutional purposes rather than mere interest aggregation or partisan warfare. Campaign finance reform illustrates this principle. Rather than eliminating money from politics, an impossible task, wise reform would channel political contributions through institutions that promote deliberation over pure electoral competition. Public financing of campaigns could reduce representatives' dependence on narrow interests while preserving competitive elections that ensure democratic accountability. Congressional procedure offers another opportunity for conservative reform. Restoring meaningful committee deliberation, requiring actual debate before votes, and creating incentives for bipartisan cooperation would help representatives develop the kinds of working relationships that enable practical problem solving. Such reforms would strengthen rather than weaken Congress by enabling it to fulfill its constitutional functions more effectively. The principle of subsidiarity that I advocated throughout my imperial writing suggests that many contemporary federal programs should return to state or local control. Education, criminal justice, and social welfare often require the kind of local knowledge and community engagement that distant federal bureaucracies cannot provide. Decentralizing such programs would both improve their effectiveness and restore meaningful state representation. Yet some challenges genuinely require national attention. Climate change, technological regulation, and global economic competition involve issues that transcend state boundaries and require the kind of comprehensive national policy that only federal government can provide. The art of federalism lies in distinguishing between these categories rather than assuming all problems require the same level of governmental response. International trade offers a perfect example of how Burkean principles apply to contemporary policy. Rather than choosing between pure free trade and pure protectionism, prudent policy would recognize that different industries and regions face different competitive challenges requiring different policy responses. Representatives must balance their constituents' immediate economic interests with long-term national prosperity and international stability. Immigration policy similarly requires the kind of prudential judgment that transcends ideological sloganeering. America benefits from attracting talented immigrants who strengthen economic dynamism and cultural vitality, but immigration must occur at a pace that permits successful integration into American constitutional culture. Neither open borders nor closed borders serves the national interest as well as policies that welcome newcomers while ensuring they can become genuine Americans. The revival of civic education represents perhaps the most crucial contemporary application of my principles. Citizens cannot exercise intelligent democratic choice without understanding constitutional principles, historical precedent, and the complexity of governing large diverse societies. Such education must cultivate political judgment rather than mere partisan loyalty. Most fundamentally, American democracy requires the revival of what I called political affections, genuine care for constitutional community that transcends immediate self-interest. Representatives and citizens alike must recover the sense that they serve something larger and more durable than their own advancement or even their own generation's prosperity. Conclusion. The American experiment in representative government has succeeded beyond what even its founders dared hope, but that success has bred complacency about the civic virtues and institutional wisdom that constitutional democracy requires. My experience in Parliament teaches that free government represents not a natural state but a delicate achievement requiring constant cultivation and prudent reform. The principles of representation I articulated, independent judgment within constitutional bounds, deliberative distance from immediate passions, balance between local knowledge and national perspective, remain as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. American democracy thrives when representatives understand themselves as trustees of constitutional tradition rather than mere agents of momentary majorities. Yet these principles require renewal in each generation through the kind of practical wisdom that cannot be reduced to abstract rules. Citizens must choose representatives capable of political judgment, and representatives must exercise that judgment even when it conflicts with apparent constituent desires or partisan advantage. The choice before America mirrors the choice I placed before Parliament during the imperial crisis. Will you preserve constitutional community through prudent reform, or will you allow institutional decay to destroy the very possibility of ordered liberty? The answer depends on recovering what I called political prudence, the art of applying eternal principles to changing circumstances through experience, reflection, and genuine care for the common good. Your constitutional heritage provides the framework, but each generation must supply the wisdom and virtue necessary to make that framework serve human flourishing across time.